All right, so thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit about our perspectives on SEND data. Before I do that, I wanted to make a comment on last night. I was sitting here and watching the different slides, and especially for those of you that were on that slide that have been here sort of all 5 years, sometimes you don't know success until you've passed way by it. I wanted to thank you all for the work that you've done in making this collaboration a success, and it really is a success. And often we don't take time to actually sort of plant the flag in the ground and say, we've done it, we've passed that point. So we have passed that point. All the work groups are actually producing an amazing amount of work that's very useful. So if we could give ourselves a round of applause real quick for that. I think at the beginning, for the first 2 years, it's something that we all really believed in, that we could do something different, that we could have a collaboration in this way and not have a regular meeting, but a meeting that we are working at and we're doing. And those first 2 years, though, I mean, feel like something you believe in, but also sort of like a toddler, right? Like very wobbly, but resilient. And we sort of made it our way out of there. And so I think that's fantastic, and I thank you all for being here and joining us in this work. So on to SEND. So we're going to talk a little more about SEND data, about our perspectives on it. And then in the end, I'm going to bring in some clinical data perspectives as well from a technical side, because they're the same, whether it's clinical or non-clinical. So I'm going to talk a little bit about data submitted from regulatory applications, our experience with test submissions, and then at the end to talk about data loading into JANUS, sort of the technical side. So Mary talked a little bit about functional learnings from clinical data. I'm going to talk about sort of the technical things, both from non-clinical and clinical. So as far as SEND goes, we're receiving data per the 3.0 version. According to the data standards catalog, we have validation rules available. We're using the same validator for both clinical and non-clinical data. The non-clinical SDRG is in use and development. As you saw, there was a Federal Register notice just recently. However, we've been getting them throughout the development, and they are very, very helpful. So thank you for that. And also in support of SEND, we have a Kickstart service, which is somewhat similar to the Jumpstart service, just applied to non-clinical. The data is a little less complex, so the scale of it is smaller, but it takes the same principle in order to prepare reviewers and help them be successful in reviewing the data. So that's our current status. I wanted to talk a little bit about what we find from the non-clinical perspective compared to the technical conformance guide. And encouragingly, I don't have much to say. We don't find many SEND issues that are related to non-clinical specific information in the technical conformance guide. That being said, we know that there needs to be more information in there, more guidance in the TCG, and that will be coming. So just want to make folks aware to keep their eyes on that important document, because that is updated and will be updated regularly. So some comments on our experience with validation, both from the regulatory submissions as well as the test submissions. All the regulatory submissions loaded for review, so that's a good thing. The great thing is that there were no critical data issues in any of the regulatory submissions that we've gotten so far with SEND. So the quantity isn't where I would like it to be, and we'll get there, but the quality is pretty good. We have seen issues with the test submissions, and hopefully that's not a sign of things to come for when those finally come in. And I would say that most of the conformance issues are identical to the clinical submissions, but with fewer clinical or critical errors, which is why in sort of the end I'm going to talk about these things together, because data is data, and it seems that people are having the same problems with both. But I want to highlight a couple things, is that validation is not everything, right? Because there's some sloppiness you can't catch with a validator, and I'm going to do a little shaming because I'm not as polite as Mary. So I'm just going to show a couple examples of some of the things that we see. So it's really simple stuff, and there's a bright side to this that I'm going to talk to at the end. But simple inconsistencies, right, where everything structurally is okay, right, planned number of subjects, planned number of male subjects, but you look at the descriptions, and the description says it's all males, but it's males and females, right? So reviewers use these labels, right? They're using the labels and the notes that are in there, right? So there's things that are going to pass validation, right, but you still got to make sure that they're solid. You got to look through it. You got to make sure that everything is correct in there, because they're going to be using those labels, and they're not going to understand what's going on if they're using that. Other simple things where people are using correct CT, but it's not what's in the study report, right? So this is sort of another example we've seen, not in the regulatory submissions, but it's sort of in test submissions, where people put in once, it was once per day, right? So just simple little mistakes. So, make sure you're QCing that data. The last one of these that I want to mention is that we do see a decent amount of CT errors, and CT is really important. We didn't create controlled terminology just for the fun of it. We actually created it if and when there was a need for it, right? So please pay attention to that. It is critically important in a lot of areas. For instance, with carcinogenicity studies, the tumor names, they have a controlled terminology. The statisticians rely on those, right? So those need to be right? So, but also, in addition to the CT being important, sometimes your CT error, if you're getting an error, might point to a different problem that you're having with the data set. And we've seen this in a couple different ways. I threw up an example of where whatever the collection method was, it was sort of using an original result for multiple things. In this example, CS is a clotted sample, which is basically saying we couldn't do it, right? So, but this wasn't sort of null and propagated into the not done, and the reason not done is a clotted sample. It was just kept that way. So it was throwing an error, right? But people were like, oh, it's a CT error. I guess that's not as important. Well, first of all, it's important. And the second thing is just encourage you to look through that and figure out what the reasons are, because it might not just be a CT issue. You might have, you're not describing the data accurately issue. So I'm going to jump a little bit to the sort of the end findings of this sort of next part, because it's a transition from talking about our experience with SEN specifically, and talking about CTR in general, so clinical and non-clinical data. I'm going to talk about what the clinical trials repository is in a second. But these are the critical data quality issues that we see. When I mention critical quality issues, it's whether we're able to load and process a study so that it makes that data available for tools that reviewers are going to use. Here's the main things that we see. We see duplicates in a couple different ways. They're kind of somewhat different categories, so duplicates might be a sort of a false category, but duplicate trial element codes, duplicate trial visits, duplicate records and trial summary. We have some structural issues where we have duplicate study ID values. Simple things, one record per subject per test per collection date is what we need to see. I mean, just this sort of pretty straightforward structural issues with the data, showing it as an incorrect data type, special characters, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that we see a lot that impedes loading is missing trial summary information, and we need that so that we can search for and bring up those studies later. And some of this information, as I sort of mentioned before, kind of looks like sloppiness. I mean, missing trial information, some trial summary information is a little bit like hitting a homer and forgetting to tag third, right? So it's simple information that you can put in there to make it really complete and make it useful for us. Just other things, missing units is another one. Invalid or incomplete defined files, right? So as you can see, there's some structural issues in here that are really fundamental to getting the data right, but there's also a lot of metadata issues that we're really focused on. So I wanted to just give you that first before I talk a little bit about CTR and some of the metrics that we have around that. But before I get there, it's just to let you know about the different ways that we process clinical and non-clinical data. So there's processing, there's validation, there's loading, and then there's use. And they're parallel. I know that we talk a lot about, here we're going to talk about send and talk separately about SDTM. but it's very similar data. It's according to the same model. It's being processed in very similar ways. So there are some differences. Obviously, when it's reviewed, that's very different. But up until that point, it's a very similar process. So the JANUS Clinical Trials Repository is where the data sits. DataFit is used for validation. And then there's various tools that's used for that. And then for each of them, we also have a service that we provide that enable people to use that and also to help with the change management. As Steve mentioned, some folks aren't always sort of into and aware of all the changes with data standards and what's this going to do for them. And those are services that we provide to help them sort of help with that change management and get them to that place where they realize the benefits and how to use those tools. So I mentioned the CTR. The Clinical Trials Repository is a data repository for subject-level clinical and toxicology trial data. The idea is to build up a repository that so at some point that you have historical information, you can look across, not only get your study the way that you want it and get that integrated with other studies from that submission, and even look across submissions. And also to look across different domain types, so looking across clinical and non-clinical. So we are building out that repository. It's been operational for a year at the FDA. We're currently ingesting SDTM and SEND data. We're not doing all of it right now. Our goal is to do so probably next year. Right now, it's mainly to support our services that we provide. And the reason I'm talking about it here in the perspectives of your data is that the errors that we see for loading inform sort of the technical issues that you need to be aware about. So I already showed those because I wanted to show those sort of up front, but I want to show a few metrics about those as well. Now I'm going to show stats that are our experience with the clinical data, but since the issues are roughly the same, the outcomes are basically the same as well. So this is a graph that shows over a year our data loading overview. And this shows first load failure rate by month, right? So how often did a study fail when we just tried to load it the first time, right? You can see when we started, we're at 100%, right? That's not good. But it's gotten better over time, right? So we're getting to like 2/3 of the time it's still not loading. That's not great, but you can see that there's a trend for improving data. And that's really good news. And I think part of that is because of Jumpstart, and part of that is because of the validation rules and the engagement we're having with everyone, and also sort of as the field matures, people are getting better at that data. And also once they realize that the things that I mentioned in the other slide are really important, like trial summary and pieces like that, it tends to get better. So why are things not loading on the first attempt? To go into that a little bit, so like right now, loads on the first attempt about 22%. Could not load on the first attempt is 74%, and then just can't load, that's about 4%, right? Like there's no way we can load it up. So for the could not load, the reasons for that are missing defined files. There's other significant issues, meaning we can't load without additional information from the applicant, right? There's just information that's not there. We don't know what it is, and we're not going to be changing data, so we just can't load it. But as I noted, a lot of studies could not load initially, but do eventually load. The critical data issue quality issues that I mentioned are about half of those. About 43% have issues with their defined files. About 49% had issues with their trial summary domains. And so something that I want to get across is there's really relatively simple fixes to drastically improve our experience with the data, our ability to process, and our ability to use it. And then there's other loading issues where about 11%. Files are too large, just sort of random issues that don't fit into those critical quality things that I mentioned before. So I'm going to not talk about this too much. I wanted these to be in the slides so people had access to them later. We also have some posters that I would encourage people to look at to see what is important to us and what kind of errors that we find. These are examples of some defined file errors, and then I have some examples of trial summary errors. And as you can see, again, sort of getting back to the sloppiness thing, is that there's just a lot of simple things that could be done that will drastically improve our experience with the data. And then I threw in some other pieces, non-standard variables, invalid date values, and pieces like that. Oh, good. So again, I'll say it again and again and again. Relatively simple fixes can have a drastic effect on us. But, I know that was sort of, maybe not the happiest message to give, but there's a happy side to it too, which is that other than CT, there are no real finding domains issues that we see very often and consistently. So in some ways, the fact that what we see as a problem is just sloppiness is a very good sign that we have serviceable models, right? So people aren't making real critical mistakes where we get data and be like, what the heck is this? I don't know what this is. I don't know how to use it. I don't know how to load it. If there's mistakes, they're generally pieces where it's like, oh, well, they did that wrong. They should have done X. So in so much as it's true that we do need to get better data in, and there is some work to be done, it seems like that the models that we've worked on and the implementation that has been worked on has been successful, right? And so that means that we do have a very good way forward. We just have to fix those issues. And I think that that's very positive, because it would be much worse if people were extraordinarily careful and still couldn't get the data in a way that we could use it for review. So I think that overall that's a really good sign. So thank you very much.